Hello team, welcome to another ATP geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, and my good friend Jonathan Fink with co-stream with Silicon Curtain. And it's been some time since we've had a little chat, and what better opportunity, Jonathan, than to chat at a time when the world appears to be going to hell in a handcart. How are you, Jonathan? Are things okay with you?
There's no one I'd rather spend the last few minutes of existence on this mortal coil with, and it does feel a little like that. No, kind of stretched. I mean, another reason is I know you do multiple live streams a day, but I'm just moving into doing a news item per day as well as the interviews, and of course it's difficult sort of balancing everything, but it's a fire hydrant of news, so it's also difficult choosing what topic to focus on for those episodes.
What I've found, Jonathan, is that over the course of this war, and when I say this war, what I mean is the Ukraine war.
Yes, which one exactly? You have to be specific now, Jonathan.
Yeah. Obsessed with the Ukraine war as I am, I have found that everything is connected, right? And it is very difficult geopolitically to discuss one topic without having at least a working knowledge, an understanding of what's going on in another topic, and even to understand like the motivations of, say, for example, Donald Trump on the international circuit. You kind of need to understand what's going on domestically with him, and what floats his boat and how he operates. And so you end up delving into all these different areas in order to be able to comment with any kind of knowledge on a particular domain. So when we talk about Ukraine, we're talking about Russia, of course, but we're talking about Europe, all the allies, G7, EU, the United States, and then all of those entities on their own as well, with their own motivations, and then China, and then so you end up reporting on the entire world, and your brain just starts
tricky, isn't it? And of course, the Middle East comes with, dare I say, a lot of baggage and nuance as well. You wouldn't necessarily know that from all the commentary out there, but you and I have immersed ourselves in a lot of the history of Ukraine and Russia, and actually it's a big task to try and make nuanced commentary that actually gives a nod to all of that sort of background information and history. Doing that for multiple regions of the world, that's kind of tricky. That's why I've come to be very skeptical about those sort of realist, so-called realist geopolitical experts who actually, make a virtue of not knowing all the context, but bring these more abstracted ideas to a reason, to a particular region. That seems to me utterly nonsensical in the light of what we've been doing.
I'm presently reading Alexander Vindman, who is a US politician with Ukrainian background and a veteran. I'm reading his book, The Folly of Realism, where he is looking at realism with a very critical eye, and yeah, that's proving interesting as well. So yeah, I've been meaning for some time to do a series of a debunking series of taking particular points and then going to town on them, like the idea that NATO expansionism. Now, I know I've done lots of segments on different videos talking about these issues and debunking them, but it'd be nice to just for posterity and reference to have these separate videos for debunking the myths of the Ukraine war.
That's it. And someone like Anna from Ukraine does a great job actually of taking these not just debunking propaganda, but taking some of the big historical mythologies. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I spent the weekend with some old friends who are more interested than most in how the channel's going and so on. And one or two are very well versed in the region, read a lot of history, etc. And yet even there in those conversations, I found myself certain things people said jarred, certain things which to someone from the outside might sound very erudite, but actually when you unpack them, they're mythologies. They're mythologies and ideas that help people sort of put a whole topic to bed. Now, I'll give an example there, something like great Russian literature. So we're talking about the sort of toxicity of Russia, etc. And this person said, yes, but But, you know, Israel's got Israel, confusion here, but Russia has got a very rich history of literature, strong literature, as if somehow, you know, that excused the violence and oppression. But also I realized that it's a kind of mythology, because for Russian literature to thrive, it had to exterminate and suffocate other indigenous literatures from the area. So it's almost like a sort of slash and burn technique, where for your little patch of greenery to kind of thrive on all the nutrients, you've had to sort of clear a vast kind of space. And it makes me think, you know, that so much of geopolitical analysis, and indeed the media, is people reaching for these packaged ideas, packaged phrases, which might seem erudite, might seem like they have great explanatory power, but actually can be extremely deceptive and outright wrong if you start to take them apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, you know, people don't have the time necessarily, unless you're deep in obsessed in these topics, to investigate the nuances. And so it's very easy to sink these maybe the disinformation, the misinformation, and the simplistic overviews and whatnot. So yeah, that's completely I guess understandable that someone would have those kind of views. So tonight is a night where it looks like the US is on the precipice of joining Israel. I did a very extensive live video today where I talked to people through the position that the United States has with Ukraine at the moment, which is typical, you know, what we know. Donald Trump basically throwing the Ukrainians under a bus, but then running towards another war in Iran to support Israel. And my overall thesis, I'd be interested to see what you think about this. I was drawing from sort of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell I was listening to the other day, when they're saying, look, when you look at what Donald Trump has done in the world recently, you know, he said he's going to stop the war in 24 hours in Ukraine. He's going to do this, do that, no more wars. I am the president of peace, but has been unable to stop the war in Ukraine. Putin has, I think, Trump in the palm of his hands, putty in his hands. And I think Putin is dictating the foreign policy of Trump from that neck of the woods. And Netanyahu is essentially has a blank check to do whatever he wants and is dictating Trump's activities from his point of view. And then Trump is backing down to China with the kind of taco Trump approach of so on and so forth. And the point that they were making is that the American hegemony is waning, and that other people are manipulating Trump quite easily. And in fact, people are just unsure of what the United States stands for anymore and what they represent. And given that chaos and confusion, people are just pushing the envelope and potentially are going to be more emboldened to do nefarious things. And yeah, so that's where we're at, this state of waning US sort of soft and hard power. What are your thoughts?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, when we look at it in the Russia-Ukraine context, we see that Trump disbelieves or distrusts the information from his own intelligence services, certainly in the first administration, and is inclined to believe Putin. And we might say, oh, that's because he's an agent, an asset, and a blah, blah, blah. I think it's partly because he operates on a different level, in that whoever he spoke to last, and if that person is very compelling, persuasive, or even manipulative, then he is deeply affected by that. And he gets his information through that personal connection, not through written materials. What we now see is that his rhetoric changes almost 360 degrees from the sort of almost nativist, isolationist stuff, which is, and actually maybe to be commended, you know, we shouldn't get involved in these wars, we shouldn't start additional wars, etc., to what we hear tonight, which is, as you say, rhetoric which suggests the US is about to jump fully into the conflict, we'll come in a minute to the aircraft carrier that seems to be steaming its way towards the Gulf. But that follows hard on the heels of a conversation or multiple conversations he's had with Netanyahu. So it seems he is exceedingly open to direct manipulation by powerful and strong-willed people who do actually have, let's say, a strategic purpose.
Yeah, it's worth sort of, I guess, letting people know what's kind of going on potentially at the moment. One thing that was pretty worrying from, I guess, anyone's point of view is that Iranian state TV have cryptically warned the following, quote, urgent, a night the world will not forget, stay tuned. So they are basically warning the world that there's some crazy stuff that's going to happen and the Iranians are going to be at the helm there. We had some statements from Trump earlier in the day. He said unconditional surrender, which is that what's bizarre at the moment, Jonathan, is that international foreign policy appears to be being conducted via Truth Social, which is odd. Like, not only is he saying unconditional surrender, like, to whom is he talking? And what's just, but there's no context, just capital letters, unconditional surrender. Okay, right, fair enough. Then he says,
is that the US surrendering to lunacy? Putin?
We know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. He is an easy target, but is safe there. We are not going to take him out. Brackets kill. Thanks for just explaining that. At least not for now. But we don't want missiles shot at civilians or American soldiers. Our patience is wearing thin. Well, your patience. This is like Israel and. Anyway, whatever. Thank you for your attention on this matter. So then he's like literally threatening a world leader on Truth Social. So just like, what are your thoughts on this?
He's demented. He is quite literally demented. And in that sense, I mean, he has some form of degenerative brain disease. But if you listen to his interviews and pronouncements over the last couple of decades, they're not fundamentally different. The content isn't fundamentally different, i.e., there is no greater quality of insight and content that comes from his pronouncements 2 decades ago. It's just, they sound a little bit less like they're coming out of someone whose brain is geriatric. But it's the same kind of stodgy nonsense with no historical context, no analytical capability, no strategic understanding. In that sense, he hasn't fundamentally changed, but he certainly is, I think, increasingly decrepit. There is a rumor, which I guess we'll come to in a minute, not just, Iran, Israel, which is why he was whisked away from the G7, or not just because he didn't want to actually face Zelensky, or maybe his handlers in Moscow decided it was better not to, have another one-on-one session with Zelensky. It's also been rumored that he kept falling asleep in the G7 and was looking sort of alarmingly frail in some ways. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a minute, but he will make no sense. He makes no sense. He never will.
So I'm reluctant. Well, I'm not really reluctant. I embrace it fully, but I worry sometimes that I'm just anti-Trump, right? And I just have a thing about Trump, and I have Trump derangement syndrome, right? But actually, I think I'm justified.
You have that in spades. I mean, we both do. It's a virulent disease.
But it is justified, right? And yes. So this man is an old man. He's 79 now. He, as you said before, and this is a really important point. I know I keep going on about it, but if he doesn't take intelligence briefings and he doesn't read, right? Like you said, where's he getting his information from? The people that literally just speak to him on the fly quite quickly. He's going, or when he's playing golf or this and that. There's no. I don't think he has a fundamental, granular, detailed knowledge about really anything that's meaningful in the world that he needs. I don't think he has a requisite knowledge for what he needs to sit down with world leaders for 3 days of meetings or 2 days of meetings at G7, right?
No.
So like when he's sitting there as a 79-year-old man who's falling asleep at the parade, who's falling asleep in the cabinet meetings that he's been caught like closing his eyes. And he talks about sleepy Joe Biden, but actually Donald Trump is doing that, and he's doing that at the G7 meeting, but partly because I don't think he's going to really access what they're talking about. He's much more comfortable standing in front of a bank of photographers, getting asked questions and then sounding off about whatever, than he is sitting in a meeting and having to interact and speak with knowledge and depth about any given subject.
He can't do any of that. And he doesn't have people to spoon feed him, where in the White House, they may be able to chunk up briefings or, create a format where they've got constant distraction and visual aids and materials that keeps his attention for more than a nanosecond. They cannot do that in the context of these international meetings. He would just have to sit there, and I'm sure most of it washes over him. And he's just waiting for the moment when he can inject some absolute nonsense into the proceedings, which he probably will only do when the cameras are on. When the cameras aren't on him, I imagine he probably feels rather isolated in those events, and probably just switches off. Unless he's sitting there doodling into a notepad, there's really nothing to hold his attention. I imagine, though, when he speaks to someone like Putin, when he speaks to someone like Netanyahu, they have probably studied him in great detail, and they probably find methods of discourse that keep his attention. That may be one of the reasons why he regurgitates so many Russian talking points and now has started to regurgitate Israeli talking points too. I don't think he's just getting it from his advisors and his internal team. I think these are packaged up and framed in a narrative format by intelligent world leaders who've been briefed by their own psychologists and intelligence officers of how to inject these narratives into his senile and rather unique operating system that runs the Trump brain.
I think it's interesting you were talking earlier about ignoring intelligence. So you were referring to the Helsinki debacle where, I presume you were, where Trump was at the presser in Helsinki in 2018, I think it was, and he put Putin above his own intelligence services.
That's
and said,
one of the most famous examples, but there's been a few of them,
Yeah, so he publicly effectively dissed his intelligence services and then favored a dictator who was previously working for the KGB. And that was just absolutely terrible. But then today we hear that, he's gone back early from the G7 meeting precisely because of the Iran war, it appears. So US officials briefed by the Israelis. So he's done that. So this is all about Iran developing or being close to developing and enriching uranium to the point of developing a nuclear weapon, right? All the capabilities for a nuclear weapon. That's what Iran is saying. But there is potentially, and I'm actually broadly in favor of activity against Iran the way that Israel has done it. And actually, I think I'm in favor of the US getting involved as well. Like, I'm not massively against that, right? I think if there's any time for a regime change in Iran, it is now. Like you are not going to have any other opportunity, and I think they are a dangerous theocracy, right?
Yeah.
But there are also elements of weapons of mass destruction, Iraq style, right, where people are claiming that there's a situation that isn't actually reality, potentially. So Shashank Joshi reports from the Wall Street Journal, US officials briefed by the Israelis weren't convinced that the information pointed to a decision by Tehran to build a bomb, according to a senior intelligence official, another US official, and two congressional aides familiar with the discussions. We also know that the US previously had given a report. In fact, the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had previously stated that, testified in March, that Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon, and to which Donald Trump was asked. He was asked about this on a plane, and he gave this answer. I'll just bring that here. So Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon, says the journalist. Trump then says, I don't care what she said. They were very close to getting a nuke. So there are two things to talk about here, and I'll be really interested in what you think. So one is ignoring intelligence briefings from or intelligence reports from the US in favor of perhaps the last person he spoke to, or the Israelis, or the power that Netanyahu, or the power that Israel has over the United States and the narrative. So that's a one thing. And the second thing is, and I spent a lot of time talking about this earlier today, the fracture in the Republican Party that is taking place between the neocon, old school, globalist, war hawk Republicans and the MAGA isolationist Republicans. And you're having Tucker Carlson, even Tulsi Gabbard, Steve Bannon saying, what are we doing going to war? This is the wrong thing. We voted Trump in on being a peace president and we're going to war. And you have Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and all these kind of old school Republicans saying we need to go and smash Iran up fully. Yeah. So you got two things on there. Ignoring the intelligence from your own departments, and then a fracture in the Republican Party. Any thoughts on those?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there will be many in Trump's base who will not appreciate if he gets involved in another war, even if it's remote strikes and even if it's a sort of one-off. I don't think this will be seen favorably by many people who voted for him. There'll be a sense of having been cheated and betrayed because they want the US to become isolationist. Tariffs are not seen in the kind of light of the sort of lunacy in the way we interpret them. They actually align and accord with some people. The shutting down of USAID, there are some people who are extremely supportive of that the US should sort of draw its claws in and let the rest of the world just sort of get on, for good or ill, with managing itself. Now, that is, of course, a naive point of view, but it definitely exists, and it's definitely a strong thing. This is the curious thing about Trump's policies here. You know, he's come to power based on a certain set, I think, of beliefs amongst his core base. Some of those beliefs are going to be a little bit flexible. If Donald the King decides that something is good, then on certain issues they'll go along with it. On certain issues, I think he doesn't have that flexibility to move his base along. One of those is getting entangled in foreign wars. However, I'm in two minds, as you are. I mean, when the US gets involved in these things, invariably it becomes an absolute quagmire. So that is an argument for not really thinking the US involvement is going to actually bring any good to anyone. However, Iran is it's an agent of chaos. It's an agent in the region of instability, and actually around the world. Just last night, and every night actually of the last couple of weeks, hundreds of drones have been aimed at Ukraine. And these are Iranian-made or designed Shaheeds. Not all of them are made in Iran anymore, but they didn't place any limitations on the weaponry and where it was to be used. They are aiding and abetting one of the world's greatest terrorists, and not just with supply of munitions, in other ways. So I have relatively little sympathy for the theocratic regime in Iran, which torments, tortures its own citizens, suppresses and kills women on a regular basis who seek, a more, let's say, sort of liberal and less oppressive mode of living. So I think it's ripe. I think we need fewer of these agents of chaos, but whether it can transition into a democracy is an open question. The example of Syria is an interesting one. You know, that regime existed, it was forever until it was no more. And then rather than the perception that everyone, if you'd asked anyone a year ago in, geopolitical circles, or all the people who are now terrified of a Russian collapse, for instance, they will also be terrified of the consequences, the chaotic consequences of a collapse in Iran. They would have said the same in Syria, that there's no way to transition to Assad, to something else, because you'll have, a patchwork of warlords, endless chaos, death, and it might be far worse even than what we've got. Absolutely not. I mean, these people are making up stories for themselves. They are making up fantastic stories based on, I'm not sure what historical examples, but based on their own preconceptions. But also these stories are a rather convenient way of absolving themselves of responsibility for dealing with evil regimes for taking action, for taking any kind of responsibility. And I think it works rather well when it comes to Russia. You know, we can't possibly let Ukraine beat Russia. We can't possibly let Israel topple the Iranian regime, because what will follow will be far worse than what we've got. That's a story. That's a made-up story. It is not factually based or scientific in any possible way. The fact is, it could go multiple ways, none of which you can predict with any certainty. And it may end up being relatively bloodless. And what replaces the regime may be infinitely better than what currently exists. But
yeah,
it does take
on that point, Kevin Force says, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we will get a regime change in Iran without boots on the ground. Iran is 3 times as big and twice the population of Iraq. Perhaps we'll be greeted as liberators. No, I would disagree, Kevin, because I think there's enough people protesting within Iran. You know, there is an appetite, I think, a considerable appetite from inside Iran that would precipitate a regime change quite easily without there needing to be boots on the ground. That's my general opinion, but you know, I could well be wrong there.
I don't think it's an equation of population either. It comes down to the threshold number of people who are willing to protest the regime, and I think it comes down to how distributed they are. You know, if this is just a threshold population in the main capital city, then it may be that this is not enough. But if you have a high threshold of protesters in provincial towns and you know, capitals of different provinces as well as the capital, then that could be an absolute trigger point. So I don't think population per se really sort of is the guiding thing here. Remember, Belarus is a much smaller country than Ukraine, both geographically and in population terms. Its revolution failed, whereas Ukraine's revolution succeeded.
Interesting.
But I don't think boots on the ground. I mean, this is one area where you do not want to be putting boots on the ground, right? You should not have US troops anywhere near it.
Yeah, no, I don't think that would happen. Yeah.
No.
So on the point of this fracture in the Republican Party, I find this absolutely fascinating because it is kind of isolationism against sort of globalism, I guess, or I don't know, maybe neocon, whatever you want to call it. And you have, so on the one hand, I was quite convinced that Trump had this cult of personality where people would follow Trump wherever he went. But actually, you've got a few now saying, no, I'm not going to follow Trump to war. Actually, I'm going to stand by my MAGA guns of America First isolationism, which I find interesting because I would have thought they would have adapted America First to fit whatever Trump says. But actually, you remember do
vaccines, have Jonathan. Remember vaccines when Trump actually made some statements that were positive towards vaccines. There are many his base were like, on this issue, they'd say, and everything else I agree with the Trumpster, but on this issue, this for me is an issue that transcends, you know, Trumpism and Trump. There are certain things. Now, I think abortion would be another one. There are certain core beliefs that override his cult status.
But I do think that there will be a lot of the base who will also go with him, because actually, I was saying in my video earlier that if the US joins in with Israel, and we can talk about what ways the US can support Israel. It doesn't have to be over like massive bombers going in and doing crazy stuff. It can be refueling, all sorts. But if the US does go in and help, and Trump goes, hey, we've won, look what we've done. Imagine there's a complete military success for the Israelis with the Americans. Then that will give ammunition to the USA. And there's the idea of MAGA Americans, or any American really, that you want your country to be like, you know, to be able to flex and be sort of, scare quotes, proud of them flexing, right? And so there will be a lot of the MAGA crowd who might have said, yeah, I'm all for peace, but these guys have been brought up on a diet of Cold War films and the US doing amazing stuff, and this kind of culture that the US is atop of the hegemonic ladder, and to stay there, winning a war in Iran with consummate ease, you know, by helping the Israelis, assuming that is what would happen, would be quite appealing. So I do think it could easily split the MAGA base actually quite easily, where the people who are maybe a bit more thoughtful, Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and even Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you could argue even Tulsi Gabbard. So we have here my colleague Peter Doocy says Fox News is reporting that Trump's director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was not invited to Camp David, where intelligence and plans were being discussed. She was on National Guard duty at the time, but US officials say she was never invited in the first place. So that's astounding that your director of national intelligence is not invited to discuss whether you go to war with Iran or not. So I think there is a split, and it's fascinating.
And, you know, there are many explanations for that. I mean, one is that you don't want her point of view there because she would be opposing it. The other one could be that, you know, actually her main job as director of national intelligence is to simply deconstruct the operation against Russia, and her remit is actually much narrower than that role would usually entail. Or maybe they think she's just a loony, and it suited their purposes to have her there. I don't know which one of those is the case. But that split is kind of interesting. And remember when, you know, the second war against Iraq was announced, we had weeks of deliberation. We had weeks of supposed evidence being presented about the weapons of mass destruction. It later turned out that some of that was exaggerated, some of that was put into a political context which the intelligence community didn't advise. It also, I remember very clearly, was the case that Saddam Hussein put out a lot of material to suggest he had WMDs when actually he'd been quite assiduously deconstructing them. I mean, that was a curious thing to do. I mean, I haven't yet seen a compelling reason as to why he was doing that. Maybe he didn't want to get attacked, so he was communicating. He was taking those apart. You know, whether you know, we can get really stuck in the mire of evidence. But the fact is, the US and other countries felt they had to convince the international community before taking action against Iraq. There's been no presentation of evidence really here. You know, we have some reports from the International Atomic Energy sort of Authority and quotes suggesting that Iran's enrichment processes go far, far beyond what would be required for any civic nuclear process. My understanding is that anything beyond about sort of 3% enrichment really is quite unnecessary for a civic program, and that Iran is at the level of about sort of 60% with some of those materials, when it's a relatively simple step to get up to the 90+% required for weapons grade. But as you say, there's no compelling evidence provided that, you know, that they're about to have a bomb or about to have an arsenal. But certainly the intent is there. I think it's quite clear that the intent to become a nuclear state is there. The concern I would have is that Russia is a close ally of Iran. Russia is rumored to have been helping North Korea develop its nuclear arsenal, nuclear capabilities further. And what we also know from intelligence is that North Korea's ballistic missiles were pretty inaccurate, with a very low sort of competency rate and accuracy rate. And Russian engineers have been assiduously working with North Korea to dramatically improve the technical capabilities and accuracy of their missiles and weapons technology. The fear must be there that Russia, as a renegade terrorist state, may lean in to help Iran develop a substantial nuclear arsenal. That to my mind is one of the arguments for taking action at this point and not waiting until, you know, there's categorical documented evidence.
Yeah, I think, you know, nip it off at the bud. And, you know, given, so it's about a probability thing with nuclear capabilities, is that you want to keep the nations that have nuclear capabilities to the bare minimum, or to the present number of countries, because the more countries that have it, the more probability you have of something going wrong, right? It's just simple maths. And therefore, you don't want anyone getting nukes, really, anyone else. but particularly a theocratic dictatorial regime, that's definitely kind of a no-go. So I think there's some pretty good rationale for stopping Iran right now, and throwing a bit of regime change on the top of that. But that regime change is always a bit controversial. I think if you can help along a theocratic dictatorship to try and embrace democracy, I think I could justify that. And
I think it's a risk that we're taking. I mean, Iran is an agent of absolute chaos in the region, and so many of the Iraq War was made infinitely worse than perhaps it should have been, because of Iran's meddling.
And it's worth noting that to say this is Lester Barnes says Israel has killed 51 Palestinians lined up to get aid, and yet nothing is said. But we have to believe a war criminal that he's done it to protect Israel from words. We have to really differentiate what Israel has done with Hamas and Gaza. Sorry, Gaza more particularly. Differentiate that from what Israel is doing in Iran. So I think we can be nuanced and say, look, I broadly agree with what's going on in Iran. But actually find what Israel have done in Gaza genocidal, and I completely disagree with their approach there.
Yes, and I to be clear on that one, I was unsure right at the start of their operation, because the label genocide was used almost immediately by many people, and I think the threshold for using that term is quite high. And the attack on Ukraine, which almost from the start, well, actually from the start, has had the hallmarks of genocidal assault, and meets almost all the criteria. I think it became clear, a few weeks into Israel's assault on Gaza, that it was ticking many of those boxes that would define it as a genocide, and it's certainly multiple war crimes and whole layers of illegality there. I think there's no question there. It's worth just saying that to the audience, that's my position as well there.
Yeah, interesting. And it also looking at the rhetoric of people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are two people in the Netanyahu administration who are despicably extreme and genocidal. And when they are saying, well, there's no one-state solution, there's no two-state solution, well, then what is the solution? It looks like a final solution, doesn't it? It looks like the solution is that Palestinians don't exist. Well, they do exist, and they're there, and that's where they live. Okay, so you are going to either kill them all or forcibly evict them, both of which are genocide. Like, there is no other option here other than genocide, given that you are refusing to accept a one-state and a two-state solution. And so, I think that is a problem. But then it gets confusing, or not confusing, it gets muddy, because whilst trying to kill Hamas, they've killed all these civilians, but they also have decapitated Hamas, right? And they've decapitated Hezbollah, and taking out both those proxies in the region has enabled Iran to then be so successful in hitting, is enabled Israel to hit Iran head on and be as successful as they have, because they've not been having to deal with the crap over here, and have gone in and been very precise and completely overwhelmed the Iranian defenses. And that's partly because they've been so successful in taking out these guys here, although the taking out of these guys here has involved genocide. And that's, life is difficult. We love blacks and whites and real definite moral evaluations, but actually, life is grey, full of greys, and very confusing and murky, and sometimes there aren't simple answers.
I think that is absolutely the case, and especially, and I had this conversation with, I think, the younger generation, that sort of TikTok generation, really struggle with nuance. And I had this conversation with someone who was in their, I would say early 20s, and he was intrigued that I was so immersed in the war against Ukraine. He said, "But isn't it the case that the Middle East is actually really simple and Ukraine's really complicated?" I'm like, no, you have to reverse that. There's an awful lot more nuance and baggage and history to the Middle East. Thousands of years of it, in fact. And what Russia's doing is, yes, there's also history there, but it's, morally far less ambiguous. Having said that, I think Israel didn't define clear aims or strategic objectives to what it's been doing in Gaza. And within those ill thought through or defined aims, it has shown absolute callous disregard for civilians. I think there's been no effort whatsoever to protect civilians from harm, to try and shield them from their operations. And I think if those operations do not have a clear, achievable objectives, and you project that into densely populated urban centers, you are criminally remiss in any case, because you've structured an operation which is almost guaranteed to inflict massive suffering. So I think both in the planning and the execution, you can level the argument that Israel is heavily involved in war crimes. However, I do not subscribe to the idea that this was unprovoked, or that it's an inevitable result of kettling the Palestinian population into the territory. I think people have a choice as to whether to try and go down a peaceful route or not. And every stage of the peace process over decades, Palestinians have chosen violence over peaceful methods, have chosen attack over any kind of conciliation. So the Israelis could be forgiven for thinking, in fact, both populations, this is a point I borrow off Yuval Noah Harari, both populations believe that the other wants them annihilated. And one could say that's deeply paranoid, except there is evidence for that. And it's likely true that a substantial part of, or a part at least, of each population does actually want to annihilate the other. So it's sort of, the paranoia is there, but it's also founded on a certain reality, unfortunately. And what do you do when someone is minded to erase you? What do you do? And that actually applies to both sides.
There's interesting comment, I don't know if you've seen it, from Chancellor Friedrich Merz from Germany, who said today in an interview, Israel is doing the dirty work for all of us. And I actually think, yeah, that sounds about right, actually, which is no one really wants war and this and that. But actually, if Iran's nuclear capabilities do get taken out, and if their armed forces, the IGRC, they're not a nice bunch of people, and if they get taken out, that kind of, okay, that makes things a little bit better. And the Shashank Joshi from The Economist says Merz is not the only official in Europe who feels this way. He's the only one that's saying it out loud.
Yes. I can't remember, mainstream politicians hinting at that in such strong terms, or even saying those things. There is an extraordinary, I won't call it political Tourette's, but there's a certain thing with Merz that he does seem to say some fairly blunt truths, which is quite interesting. We haven't fully seen him deliver upon some of those blunt truths in relation to Russia. And, there's no sign of Taurus, whether that is his choice or whether he's restricted by the coalition is not exactly clear, or restricted by his own sort of military, who say that those missiles are required for Germany's defense. If that was the case, why aren't they, commissioning the supply chains to produce more? But it is incredibly sort of interesting, refreshing to sort of get a little peek, as it were, behind the veil there. And I think there's a lot of truth in this. But as you said earlier, I don't think the nuclear capability is an imminent or immediate threat. So what's the real benefit of Iran being destabilized, or even the regime falling? Well, it won't be able to export the sort of terror that it's been exporting over decades, and it won't be able to export instability to other countries and other regions. You, for a period, may not have Iran that is, trying to play this zero-sum game with other regions, especially the West around the world. And what it would also do is take out a key ally of Putin. Imagine Syria and Iran falling within a year of each other, two of Putin's allies. Imagine the level of paranoia in the Kremlin as these regimes topple that were thought to be sort of internal and invulnerable.
Interesting comment here from Kid Jersey saying Trump seesawing back and forth because he loves the attention and it makes him feel tough, although he's never been in a fight. He acts like Israel needs his help. Meanwhile, the world just laughs at him. So this sparks in me a thought that, you know, how much of what, so assume that the US does get involved, right? And they do go and help Iran. How much of that is a decision based on strategic calculations by Trump, and how much of that is based on, oh, I could get a win here and I might look really good? Do you know what I mean? I think there is so much of what Trump does that is self-serving that I'm fairly sure he's seeing an easy win, which is true, like potentially true. So yes, if you jump in on Iran with Israel and it's Israel keep dealing out the punishment to the Iranian armed forces that they are at the moment, and if the US get involved, you think that will just gather momentum, then that's like a scare quotes easy win. What do you think? Is it?
I think there's two things here going on, and these are classic Trump. One is he'll say these things, he'll throw these things out, as you say, just to have an effect, like throwing spaghetti at the wall. How do people respond? For him, it's disassociated from action. So if he gets a positive reaction from these strong words, that might be enough to feed, you know, as Vlad Vexer calls it, feed his sort of narcissistic supply. And he may not feel that he's failed if the words have an impact and there's no kind of follow-up, because I think he's disjointed from reality enough for that not to matter. There's also another thing with Trump, is that he'll say something forceful like this until someone else points out the consequences of his action. Now, of course, there are very few people around him who are willing to do that. But if it's something with such implications, then maybe someone says, okay, Donald, you know, and if they know exactly how to position it, they're like, have you thought about this? Or that thing we said, okay, this has now happened and we need to reconsider it. And what has he done? This is where we're in taco territory, which is where someone points out the full implication of his potential actions. He'll row them back and change them. One of those things that I just saw on Twitter here is that it's been quoted in the New York Times that Iran has prepared missiles and other military equipment for strikes on US bases in the Middle East should the United States join Israel's war against the country, according to American officials who have reviewed intelligence reports. So I think Iran is probably signaling, look, we want to get back to the negotiating table. You know, they've been punched hard. They know their regime is fragile. They want Israel to lay off. So I think on the one hand, you've got this sort of carrot going on, like, yes, we will cut a deal with you, right? We'll make you look good, and we're prepared not to play games on this. On the other hand, they're saying, but if you do go further, we can punch you back in ways that you won't even expect. I don't know whether there's truth in that. You know, I don't have the military capability, and I haven't seen these intelligence reports to understand how serious they are. But I think this is interesting. So this is in Twitter. It's Shashank Joshi, who is defense editor at The Economist and a visiting fellow at the War Studies Institute at KCL. I think it's interesting. I think it's definitely interesting.
Changing the topic slightly here, I find this announcement quite interesting in the live blog on The Guardian. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, has posted a message on Twitter about the ongoing conflict with Israel, a message that comes after US President Trump said he had no intention of killing the Iranian leader for now. Citing a verse from the Quran, Ali Khamenei wrote, quote, "Help from Allah and an imminent conquest," Holy Quran 61:13. "The Islamic Republic will triumph over the Zionist regime by the will of God." To which the Israelis will say, "Well, we're the chosen ones of God, and I'm going to invoke this verse," and it's just like, my God's better than your God. But of course, being of the Abrahamic faith, their God is the same God. So, what do you do?
It's a civil war, basically.
But there you go. I just thought I'd bring a bit of theology into there. Well, not really. I brought it in and then dismissed it fairly quickly. So the question might be next at how might the US help Israel? There's a lot of talk about these bunker busting bombs. They are, I believe, the GBU 57 bombs, which can come in anything from like £2,000 to like £30,000 or something ridiculous like that. And there's this idea that the US could provide them to, some people are saying they could provide them to Israel, but actually they can't, because you need to, I believe, release those bombs from B-2 bombers only. And therefore the US would have to provide the bombers. Do the US provide just refueling tankers? There are some claims that actually that's how Israel have been operating already, because with their own fleet of tankers, they wouldn't be able to have done the sheer volume of sorties that they have. So there could be a lot of post hoc rationalization from the Americans by saying we're going to get involved now when they've actually already been involved. That's fairly typical. But yeah, so who knows how they're going to help out? There was the USS Nimitz on the way. There were tankers on the way from Europe, American refueling tankers, and it would be interesting to see what other nations. I know the British have sent planes out there, but I think we've got a carrier group somewhere in the Indian Ocean or something that at the moment is not getting involved. But yeah, there are a number of ways that that the US, I guess, can help, but I don't have any more information on that.
No, I mean, as you say, it would require specific types of munitions, which the Israelis may well not have access to, as well as the delivery platforms of those. They will have, and according again to the Atomic Energy Authority, the centrifuges and some of the key equipment actually will be in reinforced concrete bunkers. They'll need really to really disable the capabilities that Iran is developing. It won't be enough to destroy the sort of surface factories and so on. And even then, a pretty large complex, and only 2 buildings were hit. So even the surface strikes, I think, will have not caused a tremendous amount of damage. And this is an interesting question, you know. And would the US simply focus on those sites, in which case it may be a very surgical, limited involvement, or like the Israelis, would they go further? I mean, Israel has really tried to repeat the Hamas / Hezbollah attack, like the pages. They've really tried to decapitate an experienced level, an entire layer of Iranian leadership. And thereby, you know, prevent the country from effectively striking back, because it's scrabbling to fill these positions with far less experienced people. My bet, if I was a betting person, I'd say the US is really 50-50 here at the moment on whether to get involved. But if they did, it would be relatively circumspect and only focused on the nuclear sites. I would also bet that Netanyahu is not going to let up. Not going to let up if he feels the Iranian regime is struggling, that it's brittle, and that there's a chance it'll fall. He will keep pounding it if he thinks there's a chance it'll topple. That'll be my bet.
Yeah. Michaels, thanks for this comment. And I think you gave a donation to the channel the other night, right at the end of the live stream. And I thanked Michael Vujar, who's another supporter, instead of you. I got the name wrong. Just so sorry. Thank you. So thank you, Michaels, for putting that straight. And you were talking about the beepers there, and that's a good time to bring this in. Israel hints at a major escalation. You'll see surprises that make the beeper operation look simple. So that's a pager operation. So this is an interview on Merit TV this morning about the ongoing war. Israel's ambassador to the US stated, "We've pulled off a number of surprises. When the dust settles, you're going to see some surprises on Thursday night and Friday that will make the beeper operation almost seem simple." Now, if that is true, like there could be, I mean, there's already been some pretty astonishing claims about what Mossad have done on the ground. There's been a Spiderweb 2.0 version of events where drones have come out of containers, rather like the Ukrainian operation, and that has been successful. So, yeah, I think there's every chance that Iran might be under the cosh a little bit as a result of some long in the planning Israeli operations.
And you know, it's been said that this particular operation may have been underway for a decade. It's likely that the drone component was introduced relatively recently, so it's a plan that probably has, you know, long-term stages, but a degree of flexibility in terms of you know, adding in new capabilities when that's come on technologically, or whether new intelligence has come to light. But this is you know, this operation would have taken years to plan, similarly to the Beeper operation as well. Huge resources, huge foresight, huge strategic purpose stretching over, you know, many years. If they've planned something bigger, then yeah, this is probably something that's been a decade in the making. On the assumption that at some point Iran would be at the center of a plot to try and erase Israel. I mean, they as a state, and given the level of sort of not just paranoia, but evidence that countries around have conspired in the past to erase Israel from the map, it's perhaps not a surprise that they would have had extensive operations like this as a contingency. And they may feel that not just that now is the time to do it because of imminent threat, they may also feel the window is closing on a period where these operations could actually be successful. So I think there are several things driving it. In a few years, or if Netanyahu feels that his regime may not be around, they may feel that all of this planning and contingency will have gone to waste, and now is the time to capitalize on it, especially with Trump in the White House, where it's more likely they can manipulate the US into being supportive of such actions.
Yeah, I wanted to bring this in earlier. I thought it was quite interesting that Donald Trump left the G7 early to get back to the US because of the issues taking place in the Middle East, and he was due to meet Zelensky today, and that unfortunately didn't happen. And that would have been an important meeting. It might have been a meeting whereby, just like in the Basilica in the Vatican, Trump might not have had all the people around him like he has at the Oval Office. And so you get him actually listening to what's going on in Ukraine and hearing it from the horse's mouth, and you know, that recency bias, that proximity bias that he often has, could have been good for him to speak to Zelensky, and alas, that didn't happen. But I like the fact that they just put Zelensky in Trump's seat around the G7 table. It was like quite a I think it was pointed anyway. I don't know whether it's intentionally so, but I just thought it was quite nice.
I think these things are rarely happen by accident.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's what's a shame. I don't know. I think it is. Yeah, it is probably a shame for Ukraine that the Iran-Israel conflict has flared up to the point that it's going to distract away from Ukraine. And there's a G7 meeting today, and of course the horrific strikes on Ukraine overnight would have had much more purchase, I think, on the international media than they probably did, because Iran and Israel have taken up all of people's kind of thinking. So do you think that this conflict will be at the expense of support for Ukraine?
I'm not sure. On the one hand, it already has been, because those 20,000 sort of fuses or components of air defense missiles were diverted from, they were intended for Ukraine, they were diverted to the Middle East. We now know that that wasn't explicitly, you know, a standalone decision to punish Ukraine. And it was based obviously on prior knowledge that such a strike was coming. But certainly it shows where the prioritization lies. Israel, the Middle East scenario, in the US, strategic mind certainly has far greater priority than Ukraine or its civilian population. Europe needs to step in, obviously, in that case. Whether they will or not is the open question. And all the symbolism of putting Zelensky in Trump's seat is all very well, but Zelensky isn't playing card games or musical chairs or any other kind of nonsense game. He's trying to get the material he needs to prevent his country being erased and civilians being killed. So, yes, well done, everybody, but just do something real rather than playing these visual games. But it's quite clear that the US doesn't prioritize Ukraine. There's no question there.
Yeah, I think, it's nice to see a package being announced from Canada today. And there was some more sanctions announced from the UK. The EU is putting into place an 18th package of sanctions. And I think Europe and allies are stepping up. But there's still this idea, and it might be that the idea prevails because it is fact that, simply put, Ukraine needs the US. In some very tangible way. It's Europe on their own and all the allies on their own are not enough to support Ukraine in the way that Ukraine really needs. There might be some capability gap that can't be filled or whatever it is, but it seems that Europe, or it could be the calculation that if Europe decides to, and I use Europe as a shorthand here, if the allies decide to go on their own away from the United States and help Ukraine, that could push the United States away to a more isolationist and pro-Russian point of view. And they might be calculating that is counterproductive. But there is something about the United States that it's evident that no one is prepared to just go it alone.
No, and this is, I put this in an episode earlier. This is perhaps the biggest thing that's come out of this, that Trump has left the G7. He's essentially sabotaged the G7 summit. He's made the organization look and act like a sort of zombie institution. It seems to be superfluous and powerless and incapable of any kind of leadership decisions, especially when the US withdraws, consensus from it. That is deeply, deeply concerning. It also suggests the coalition of the willing is dysfunctional. We've had Starmer, who initially was sort of strong on, the idea of sending peacekeepers into Ukraine. He has now categorically come out and said that there can be no British so-called peacekeeping force without US backstop and consensus of the US. Does he not see the reality here? That is never going to happen. The US is not going to provide that ever under this current administration. So I think there's a deep level of delusion. There's a deep level of managerial mindset and inaction, and there's a total absence of strategic thinking, even when it comes to the very survival of Europe itself. Merz is the only person talking anything that remotely resembles a leader, and yet we're still awaiting the actions that correspond with those words. So it is deeply, deeply disappointing. We still continue to have countries announcing, their own individual packages for Ukraine, and to an extent, there's a little bit of coordination, and to an extent, many of those packages are initiatives of those individual countries and not part of a sort of coordinated strategic approach to this. But let's turn to the other thing. And I don't think it's intentional that the US is sort of letting all this happen or going to get involved in this in order to influence oil prices. But Trump has blocked sanctions, or is trying to block further sanctions on Russia. He's trying to prevent Europeans from coming up with a common policy on that. He has blocked the lowering of the price cap on oil to $45 from $60. So he is refusing to take the fundamental steps will not just persuade Russia to negotiate. I mean, we have to let go of that idea. Putin will not stop until he's physically stopped. He will not stop until his war machine is starved of the materials and resources to make war. Putin will not stop until his own regime is threatened and he genuinely feels insecure. These are the three requirements to make Putin stop. Physically stopping him, taking away his resources, and threatening his regime. Unless we do all three of these things, then this aggression is not going to stop. So let's just stop kidding ourselves on that. What Trump is doing, however, is providing the circumstances where Putin's regime is able to extend its aggression and hostility. It is providing the material and circumstances whereby Putin's regime is more secure and not less secure. And what Trump is doing is denying Ukraine the weapons it needs to defend itself and its territory and protect the lives of its citizens. So I would say the US is already entirely complicit in Putin's war and in extending that war and making it, and in the intensification of that war that we have seen, especially against civilians. This has already happened. It's not theoretical. And inadvertently, because this does go against what Trump's base want. They want lower gas prices. They want lower food prices. And you can only get that through not having wars in the Middle East. I think one of the net results may well be is a spike in oil prices, which damages Trump further with his base, but which provides a huge boon for Putin. And if the oil price cap isn't agreed and we have a spike in oil prices, then get ready, because Russia's going to have a lot more money to buy missiles, shells, and so on.
And the US refused to lower the oil price cap as well.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that's what the EU and I believe G7 wanted, but certainly the EU wanted. And just to because I know Mark from the Little Whiskey Shop is in my chat.
He's prolific tonight, isn't he? Here he is. Yeah.
Here's a white port that I bought from the Little Whiskey Shop, and he also sells Ukrainian wine, and an amount of that, the sales of that will go to Ukrainian charity. So please check out the Little Whiskey Shop in Stockbridge in the UK if you're UK based, and he can furnish you with some fine.
If he's minded to sponsor Silicon Curtain, I could flash the bottle on screen as well. Just hint, Mark.
Well, I do it for free. So that's, I'm not so mercenary. I'm not what's called a complete bastard, Jonathan. So Mark, this is great stuff.
I'm gonna, whatever I can get at this stage. I quite like Balvenie 18 year, just to put that out there,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe I'll think about that for your Christmas present this year. Jonathan, talking about Tulsi Gabbard earlier, this is just coming out. So Washington insiders are saying that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, will resign if President Trump orders the US military to join Israel in their strikes against Iran. Wow. And I love this reply.
There's a silver lining then, isn't there?
From Oliver Alexander says, the US should bomb Iran solely for this reason. Yeah, it made me laugh.
But it is symbolic that is a full shift back to, I would say, neocon type optics, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is. I guess ideology goes well. I don't think Trump has ideology. So when he says I'm the president of peace and these wars wouldn't happen if I was in charge, it's like, well, actually, during Trump 1.0. that war was ongoing. You forget that it started in 2014, the Ukrainian war, which is like he was saying that, Russia shouldn't have been kicked out of the G8. If they hadn't been kicked out of the G8, this war never would have started. They were kicked out of the G8 precisely because the war freaking started. And it started in 2014, you abject tool bag. So, there is that. I forgot where I was going with that. But
I mean, that was an extraordinary statement. It seemed that he turned up at the G7 simply to have a big, long, extended whinge that his mate Vlad wasn't there. That pretty much seems to be the just extraordinary. And every part of that was a ludicrous lie. Justin Trudeau was elected the year after the invasion of Crimea.
Stephen Harper was in charge. Yeah, it's just wrong.
And
wrong,
Mertz is quoted as saying, and I don't know whether he said this to Trump to his face or whether it was in a statement afterwards, but apparently Mertz said, no, Putin is not uninvited for spurious reasons. It's because in this format, in this group, we don't want warlords and killers to be part of it. No, I hope he said that to Trump's face.
That sounds great. I love the sound of that.
But even if he didn't, it's a good statement to make.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as the latest, there are claims of ballistic missiles being sent into Israel at the moment. And it's worth remembering that while I've talked up Israel's military ability against Iran, Iran still does have, although I wonder about the launchers, because the Israelis have been absolutely hammering the launchers across Iran. But Iran does have supposedly 1,800 ballistic missiles or something like that. I don't know how accurate these numbers are, but they do have a lot of missiles they can throw into Israel. Israel's a small country, and protecting from ballistic missiles is very difficult, even with the Iron Dome. We've already seen ballistic missiles get through. We've already seen some significant damage being done by the Iranians. So, you know, it's not to write off the threat that Iran can still pose to Israel, but I'm fairly sure that they have been restricted. I mean, the sheer number of commanders they've had killed is absolutely staggering. And then they had their commander-in-chief of the armed forces killed, and then they appointed someone else, and he was killed 3 days later. It's absolutely incredible what Israel has been able to do, given that they are such a relatively small country. They pack one hell of a military punch, and obviously they've had a lot of backing from the United States for an awful long time. But yeah,
it absolutely does. And apparently the trolls are very active on this one. I mean, that's one of the reasons I tend not to cover you know, this story. I mean, apart from the fact that I have far less background in this area than Russia, Ukraine, and I don't speak Arabic or Hebrew. I think it's important, you know, to me, it's important to dive into areas where, you know, you have a little bit of you know, you can talk authoritatively and guide the conversation. I don't have that background in this one. You know, I have ventured into China and had a few China experts on, but generally, you know, the Middle East is not a key focus of the channel. But I think when it comes to large geopolitical events like this, we cannot help but jump in and try to speculate, because this is regional rather than sort of, you know, local in nature. But it's also incredibly divisive, and we see this in the comments, and we also see the attention of trolls really show how divisive this is. Now, Russia is not going to be happy if Iran is targeted or taken out. I mean, what do you think Putin's going to be trying to do to dissuade Trump from taking further action?
So do you trying to work out what Putin does with regard to Iran is interesting, because obviously they signed this bilateral military agreement. It's not quite an Article 5 like they've done with North Korea, but they do have an agreement with Iran, and there was some rumors earlier today that they have like disavowed the agreement type thing, but I don't know anything about that per se. But Putin's in a difficult position because he is allied with Iran, but no one likes to back a losing horse. So if it does look like Iran is in a spot of bother, then, you know, it's another embarrassment like Syria for him. I don't know. Yeah, it's just interesting. If I was Putin, with Putin's kind of intentions and background, what would I do in terms of Iran? And I would. There have been rumors that he's trying to get hold of the weapons, Iranian like Shaheeds and warheads. It's like, oh, you're getting buggered. Oh, I'm really sorry to hear about that. You know, because I know that we're supposed to be helping you and whatnot. But we can help you by just taking all of your arms off you and using them. That'll be fine. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just to let people know that that Jack Fretwell has been removed from the comments because he's posted hundreds of comments. Half of them seem nonsensical, half of them have a trolling character. But if anyone else thinks there are other people that think should be put on the naughty step or timed out, do let us know. I know you have slightly more active, how should I say it, sort of defensive measures against troll activity.
Yeah, I have
in the
some
comments.
great mods who help out. So thank you for any mods who are active in my stream. So thank you.
We do less of this on Silicon Curtain. Having said that, I should just plug here as well. In the description of the video, there is a link to one of the fundraisers we're doing. So that is, I think I've put the Car for Ukraine one in there. And we are trying to source more of these 4x4 vehicles. So it's worth mentioning there because these are incredibly important to help Ukrainians remain resilient. And we know that actually some of these vehicles that have been sourced through these campaigns have gone to the front, have actually been hit, that actually the servicemen and women in those vehicles not only survived, but survived with minimal injuries as well. So incredibly important pieces of kit. You know, they're not just lifesavers, they're also helping Ukraine to survive and hopefully helping it towards victory. So if you're minded to help out, please check that out in the description of the video.
Likewise for myself. So here's the Summer Sunshine Trucks Car for Ukraine. We are, I haven't really talked about this an awful lot. We are just fundraising for one vehicle out of all of these because we're gearing up for a Jiggers Poor campaign that JR's arranging. But yeah, all I can say is that as long as the ATP Geopolitics channel sits above Silicon Curtain in the list, then I can die happy. That is fine. As long as JP gets to beat JF, that's all that matters.
It's fine. I'll let you have that. I will have that little victory because it's all for Ukraine. I don't feel bitter about that at all. Let you have your little triumph there. Johnny boy.
Can I just say thank you to Tremors? It just got halfway through the last live stream. That, by the way, I don't want to like blow my own trumpet or anything, but that live stream that I did earlier was really super important. And it packs an absolute bunch of information and I think sets up everything that's going on at the moment. So if you have a chance to finish that, Tremors, especially that last bit where I talk about the fracture in the Republican Party, please do so. I think it should be worth your while. Put me on 1.5, 1.75 times speed and you'll get me sounding like a chipmunk, but you'll plow through it. So also US versus Iran almost got 2025 geopolitics bingo. Yep. There's no shortage of content, right? Goose, thanks to have you on board again, Goose. We've already chatted today already. I'm up at 5 a.m. so I'll be falling asleep to your dulcet tones. No offense. Tomorrow is payday, so here's another 20. Thank you. That's really kind of you. I think going for those deep bases would be the right thing by the wrong person for the wrong reasons. That's a good way of putting it, Goose, which is assuming that you're talking about the Americans hitting bases deep in Iran, but doing the right thing, but the wrong person doing it for the wrong reason is probably a good summation of what's going on there.
I like this comment here by, I know you're going to jump a comment there. Before I lose it, Tom Firmby, and this is something I wanted to say earlier, he said Israel doesn't need manpower. They are in no threat of being invaded. And I find this extraordinarily interesting because so many of the newspapers immediately the last couple of days are like, this is going to escalate into regional war. We're going to blah, 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 blah. And they reach again, this comes back to what we said earlier, they reach for sort of stock phrases. They reach for stock concepts. But if you look at the map, how is it going to be a direct and physical war when they don't share a border, when it's highly unlikely that the countries in between would facilitate armies to cross so they could, directly confront each other? There just seems to be no context or logic when, these phrases are hauled out and, injected into the news headlines. I'm finding increasingly irksome, the lack of conscious thought behind much of what gets written about this, and the lack of consultation of actual experts. Yeah, we've got Syria.
It is
Iraq,
it's
Jordan,
worth
in the
reminding
way.
ourselves of the map, actually, because there is quite a distance between Israel and Iran. You've got Iraq in the way for a start.
Yes.
So yeah, it is going to be very difficult for any kind of. And I mean, this is a war to be won by distance munitions and
Yeah.
high tech and the air force of either
It's an
side.
interesting question as to where the jets are flying. I don't know categorically, but we do know that Israel was, curiously, it seemed at the time, flattening Syrian air defense capabilities after the revolution and Assad was finished. They went in there and they basically massively degraded Syrian air defense. Now, again, this could be in preparation for just such an operation. They may not have known the time or the date, but of course, flattening obstacles in Syria is rather a good way of then being able to overfly potentially northern Iraq and get to Iran.
Well, Iraq have complained that Israel have used their airspace. I presume Jordan would be fine with it, and Saudi Arabia would probably be fine with it. So there's probably kind of this movement around there. I presume at some point they have gone across Iraqi airspace, but yeah.
And that gives a lie to the idea as well, doesn't it? That somehow this would ignite a sort of guaranteed regional war, when actually many of the countries in this region despise Iran or the Iranian regime and would consider themselves adversaries of Iran.
Iran are predominantly Shia Muslim, and most of these countries are Sunni Muslim around here, particularly, and so there is no love lost between them, sort of culturally and theologically. So yeah, absolutely. Putin Puppet says not only, and thank you very much, Putin Puppet, not only Russia but China lose their Iranian ally, but it could be an introduction to more bad Trump actions. Yeah, it's very difficult to kind of predict the future, so there's so many variables going on. So it's a bit like Jonathan was saying earlier about saying, wondering what regime could come next, and this is often an argument as to why we shouldn't prevail, or Ukraine shouldn't prevail against Russia so fundamentally that Russia falls apart, because you could have something far worse. But yeah, that's true, but you could have something better, and I think it's a dangerous game to try and predict that with any kind of great certainty. But yeah, so again, China is an aspect of this I haven't really considered all that much.
I think of Iraq. I mean, this is going to sound perhaps controversial, and of course, petrol was poured on the flames by Iran. Potentially, Iraq may have settled down far quicker without that, and the influx of external fighters trying to turn Iraq into a battleground of ideologies. But you don't hear much about Iraq these days. Does that mean that it has significantly calmed down? Does it mean that they have a functioning democracy? I don't know the answer to these questions, but you rarely hear in-depth reports about anything happening in Iraq, which is interesting given how it dominated the headlines in the years following the second Gulf War. So again, this idea that everything that follows, even a terrible period of chaos, is going to be endless misery, may not necessarily be the case. Now, I don't know how dysfunctional or not Iraq is, and whether it's sort of turned a corner. But I think it's a dangerous idea to completely, give into inaction, because you cannot imagine a better world than the one you currently live in, especially when a country is dominated by pathological dictators, such as the one that ruled Syria and the regime that rules in Iran.
Blacklight says, and thank you very much, there are nuclear bunker busters. Maybe those earthquakes were Israel nuking underground. They had planned for this for decades. Pretty sure they would have made a nuclear bunker buster. I mean, who knows? There are theories that the Natanz nuclear facility has collapsed beneath the ground. It wasn't thought that they had affected the deeper areas, but there was another claim that it might well have collapsed. The centrifuges might have been taken out due to power cuts in the area as well. So there are differing theories as to what may have happened. But yeah, who knows what capabilities the Israelis definitely have. I'm sure they keep some things close to the chest. Michael View chart. I'm not quite sure what this says. Angry Zelensky ditched out on Canada. Early ditched out on the diaspora. I'm not sure what your point is there. JP, fix your notifications. By the way, there wouldn't have been notifications for this live stream, and quite often for my live streams, because I decide to do them the last minute. So like YouTube has no time to send out.
5 minutes before we went online, didn't we? So,
yeah, I was like, Jonathan was like, should we do a live? I'm like, are you still ready for that? It's quite late now. He's like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And then bosh, we're here. So there's no chance for notifications when that happens, which is scarily often. But thanks, Michael, appreciate that. Putin puppet, one world, three empires is Trump's doctrine. So this is the kind of idea that Trump and and Putin and Xi Jinping have three kind of competing empires and they're happy to just divvy up the world between them, and Europe sits on its own as some kind of platter to be picked at by the competing empires, and now Iran here might follow suit there. So I don't know how much Trump adheres to this kind of idea more formally, but certainly there will be people around him that might have these ideas. It was interesting that Trump stated this after G7. So he left G7 early. Emmanuel Macron then said that he's left to announce that Trump had to go to sort out a ceasefire. Trump, rather than just ignoring that or whatever, which I would have done, even if I wasn't going to try and enforce a ceasefire on Israel and Iran, I just would have like, yeah, whatever, you can think what you like. This is what I'm actually doing. Trump
but this is what his press secretary said. His press secretary said that he had to go back to sort out the Middle East situation. Macron's only repeating what Levitt had actually written in her X post. But look at this. This is deranged. This is absolutely deranged.
But it's interesting what Alistair Campbell says here, and I'll read that in a second because I hadn't considered this. So publicity-seeking President Emmanuel Macron. So he starts off with an insult. He says, insulting another world leader who is an ally. I mean, those first 5 words are astonishing. They should be astonishing, but we seem to have normalized what Trump does, and we're like, oh, yeah, he's just. But he's insulting a world leader. Publicity-seeking President Emmanuel Macron of France mistakenly said that I left the G7 summit in Canada to go back to DC to work on a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Wrong. He has no idea why I'm now on my way to Washington, but it certainly has nothing to do with a ceasefire, much bigger than that. And as I pointed out in my previous video, the only understanding of much bigger than that is if you're going to get involved in a war, right? It's bigger than a ceasefire. Well, what is bigger in the world at the moment than a ceasefire between Israel and Iran? The only thing that's bigger is joining Israel and smashing the crap out of Iran.
Yeah, tipping petrol on the flames. And then he says, whether purposefully or not, which is the classic, Trump line. When it's about to deliver some complete insult, he tries to hedge it or soften it, like, all Mexicans are rapists, but I guess some of them, might be decent people. Here, whether on purpose or not, Macron always gets it wrong. I mean, he delivers a massive insult in the first and the last few words.
It's incredible, and it's so undignified. But we're so used to it that is honestly, I can't believe people voted for this man. But I do understand it. But just, oh my goodness. But actually, Alistair Campbell might have
many people who voted for Trump will, in their own lives, hold great store, I would say, by respectful behavior and language. I mean, not all Trump supporters are deranged, and many people would have certain standards of how discourse is carried on, and certain civilities. How they can look at this and see this as being in any way respectful, I mean, they'd have to compartmentalize this so that Trump, in their minds, does and says things that they wouldn't allow themselves to do in their own personal relations. It's deeply odd.
Yes, it just staggering, isn't it? And Alistair Campbell says, I suspect he was triggered by Macron going to Greenland en route. And that is a good point, because what Macron did do was go to Greenland on the way. There's been this whole talk from Trump about taking over Greenland, taking it away as a territory from A, the EU, B, more predominantly Denmark as a NATO colleague, if you like. There was all that controversy. And then JD Vance and his wife went to visit Greenland, and everyone kind of ignored them. They had to cancel one of the places they were going to go to, this dog sled race. Had to cancel it because actually no one wanted them to be there. Then that was all disastrous. JD Vance goes and makes a speech at the military base there, to which the commander of the military base then kind of disavows stuff that JD Vance was saying and then gets sacked. So that was all very controversial. And then Emmanuel Macron announces he's going to go to Greenland, and he was met like with flags and stuff, and he, warmly received. Then goes on to Alberta to G7, and Trump will be thinking, "You bastard." That I can imagine that didn't sit well with Trump and his lot. So it wouldn't surprise me that kind of
publicity seeking may well be that.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. I didn't even make that connection. Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to go to the latest from the live blog, just to let people know. Media outlets such as New York Times and CNN have reported that US President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister have spoken on the phone, as questions remain about what the US may, whether the US may intervene or not. There's no readout of the conversation at the moment. There's the Guardian's defense and security editor has written that only the US is considered to have a bomb large enough to do the bunker busting. The GBU-57, as I said earlier, the GBU-57B massive ordnance penetrator to possibly destroy Fordow, which is one of their nuclear facilities. One of Iran's two main uranium enrichment sites, estimated to be 80 to 90 meters below a mountain. So there you go. That's the latest from there. A bit of a philosophical question. I'm going to throw this one out. This is from Mark from Little Whiskey Shop. He said, "Is a Ukrainian life worth more than an Israeli or Iranian life?" Oh, that's a loaded question. My bias dictates my view, but where do others sit? My answer from a philosophical point of view is that all value is entirely subjective. So the answer to this is yes or no, depending on what you think. There's no objective. Like, I can try and give you my own subjective answer to that, but value is necessarily subjective, and that's how we work in life with like a house. We often ask, well, what you look on Rightmove in the UK, so, what's that house worth? A house is worth whatever someone is willing to pay for it, right? So there might be a number on there, but the estate agents will try and put the highest number on there so they can make the most commission. And you as a house owner will get 3 estate agents around. Can you come and value my house? They all give you 3 different values, so you pick the highest one, because that's the one that if someone buys it at that rate, you're going to get the most amount of money. He's going to make, or she's going to make the most commission. But that only means anything if someone's actually going to be prepared to spend that much money on it. And there is no objective value of your house. It's subjective. Things are only worth how you value them. So if you value Ukrainian life more than Israeli or Iranian life, then that's the answer. But I think that's a dangerous place to go.
It's a very dangerous place to go. I think if you're going to build any kind of philosophy based on any concept of humanism, you'd have to say almost immediately that every single life, irrespective of gender, irrespective of color, irrespective of any other quality you might ascribe to it, including, able, disabled, trans or not, you would have to say that every life is and should be equally important from the point of view of the preservation of that life. Of course, when you come to the quality of life, that gets a lot more complicated, but every single life should be valued. And that's maybe not the right way to put it, because not every society has the same moral framework. Not every society, not every regime or government has the same concept of what the worth of its citizens are. We see in Russia zero, absolute zero value placed on the lives of its citizens. The citizenry, or the population rather, because you had this conversation with Zarin Zabrinsky. You cannot describe Russians as a citizenry. They are a population, because there is really, no civic society and no, say, public polity sort of left there. So it's more a question of what value does a regime or government place on people, and whether, what kind of hierarchies you have, whether it be sort of caste systems, class systems, and those internal values that are placed. When it comes to government decision making, I think it's unfortunate that there are certain ratios. Now, one, let's say in Ukraine, could be the effectiveness of the military. And there we're looking at ratios of 4, 5, 6, up to 10 to 1 in terms of Ukrainian life per Russian life lost in the war. But that's not a value system. That is just a measure of, that's a kill rate based on the efficiency of techniques, infrastructure, equipment, and all the rest. And in fact, in those circumstances, you'd want to maximize the loss of life to your enemy and minimize the loss of life to you. Russia targets civilians in Ukraine. It places zero value on them, whereas Ukraine doesn't hit civilians.
But just from your own country's point of view, you already value your own citizens' lives more than the opposition. So there is, but and the point here is that I'm sure Mark is just being honest with himself by saying Sophie's choice. You put a Ukrainian, an Israeli, and an Iranian, and you're only allowed to save one of them. Like the other two are going to get shot. Do you close your eyes and just go random? Or do you say, well, actually, like, I know so much about Ukraine or any other country, I've got this affinity with Ukraine. I have, blah, 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 all that. And you're like, I'll save the Ukrainian. So, these are the sorts of discussions you have sitting around a table in a pub, which is kind of what we're doing. Cheers, everybody.
I've been asked many, many times, why do you support Ukraine so much? My simple answer is exactly what you've said, which is, I'm steeped in, the language and the history of Russia, and therefore I'm invested in that because I actually have a much more intimate understanding of that, and that's the most simple and truthful answer. But I think it kind of goes further as well. I do not speak, the languages of Palestine and Israel. And therefore, it's more difficult to sort of penetrate the sort of cultural nuances of both of those. But I instinctively, not even instinctively, I rationally have more sympathy for Ukraine because it is a democratic society. It's a society with strong agency, and where the discourse seems to me to be more rational rather than theologically based. And it's a country that has, and I get to that, whether it's innocent or not. I mean, it's definitely innocent, but I don't want to sort of say that the Palestinians aren't innocent. But it's a country that has, I would say, forward-looking, non-theocratic kind of foundation. And I am more sympathetic to that. I just absolutely am, because it aligns more with my values. Whereas I have sympathy for Palestinian victims, but I cannot have sympathy for terroristic elites that are driven by a theocratic view of the world. I'm an avowed militant atheist, and I have really no sympathy for religious zealotry in any particular form. That also means that I look upon Netanyahu and some of his some of the sort of right-wing and more extreme religiously motivated people in his cabinet. I look at them with really little to no understanding of what motivates them, and not a huge amount of sympathy either.
I generally agree with Tom Fernby. I mean, for me, this all started out from a very moral point of view, and I've expressed this many times. That indignation, moral indignation of this country being assaulted by an aggressive, oppressive dictatorship with no regard for human life. Yet, so that's why I'm completely deep into this war on the side of the Ukrainians, and that will obviously bias any of my evaluations of comparative worth. But in principle, all life is exactly as you say. In principle, all life is worth the same. But like, then I look at my kids versus some random tow rag on the road, and I'm going to be like, yeah, I definitely saved the tow rag on the road. But no, obviously my children, obviously, obviously. So yeah,
of course, you prioritize them. There's no question. Even if it wasn't even a tow rag, it's of course they come first. No, but I think that element you mentioned there is important as well. Russia is an imperial entity, so there is a slight difference here in that what you see in terms of Israeli oppression, which is actually horrific, and the fact that all possible solutions are sort of seemingly closed off intentionally, which gives rise to there being sort of no hope, no way out for any Palestinians, is a terrible situation. But the ramifications of that conflict are not as great for the world, I think, as a resurgence of Russian imperialism. I think it's just a bigger strategic issue.
Two things before I guess we sort of meander towards a beautiful conclusion. Two things. First of all, this I thought was an interesting fact, if it is indeed true. Russia has been promising to deliver 50 Su-35 fighter jets. So these are sort of 4.5 generation, 4.5 generation fighter jets. To Iran since 2021. Then the deal was modified in 2022. Iran gave Russia 1,700 Shahid drones in exchange for 24 Russian fighter aircraft, but Russia never delivered the planes to Iran. Ouch. But bet Iran are happy that they got into bed with Russia there. And then there's this. I think that's quite clever. The power of AI. So have a look to see who that is. The combination.
That is Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump Bush.
Mr. Trump Bush, indeed. Well, that's quite poignant, given it's another middle. Someone was saying that in my lifetime, that I've experienced 3 Republican presidents who have screwed the economy and then gone into an expensive war in the Middle East. Like. Yeah. Okay. That sounds about right. Yeah. So
it's interesting whether this is just all words from him or whether actions will follow. And certainly some of the things he said, which is like total capitulation, which is demanded, and all the hints that he's made. Is he how is he going to pull back from those if nothing happens?
The other issue, I think, is that the US shouldn't be pulled into a war without congressional consent. Otherwise, it just looks like a dictatorship. And I'm sure the legality dictates that. I mean, that's what senators like Bernie Sanders and Chris Murphy, and even Republican lawmakers as well, Tom Massey, have talked about how. In fact, the 2 of them are introducing bills to make sure that Trump doesn't do that. And whether you disagree with the war or whether you disagree with the US joining in and supporting Israel or not, either way, a democracy like the US, I hope, is still a democracy, and the unified executive theory hasn't quite yet made Trump a dictator. And if it is still a functioning democracy, then it needs to be up to Congress to make that decision, because the United States is not facing an impending existential threat here as far as we can understand. There is no emergency whereby Trump has to make a unilateral decision, and so therefore Congress must be the deciding factor here.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, the US does have not just vestiges, it has substantial parts of its democratic infrastructure theoretically are still there and could provide some pushback. And this is maybe one for our next discussion. There's breaking news that another US lawmaker has been arrested and manhandled in the full glare of the cameras.
Absolutely shocking. That was, he was accompanying people to the courthouse for immigration.
Yes.
Yeah, for immigration procedures, and he was, that looks pretty bad.
It looks bad. It follows on the news of the US senator that was handcuffed last week. No, these are counter arguments to say that actually the US is becoming increasingly dictatorial, not just in theory and practice, but also it is not embarrassed to use the optics of that very publicly, i.e., it's losing any sense of shame in the face of these. And I think that's, when dictators sort of hide these things behind closed doors, it's bad. When these are done in the full glare of public attention and the regime doesn't care, that's extremely worrying. I think we should touch upon that certainly when we speak next. Another topic I think we should touch upon, which has been brought to the fore by what's happening with Iran, are all these hints that leaders of regimes are not immune to being targeted as well. I think once that can of worms is open, then this could become interesting. I'm doing an episode later in the week, which I'm going to call the
by what? What do you mean?
Assassination.
Yeah.
If the idea that the key leaders are not immune to that, that means that, who could be next? Lukashenko,
I wonder why
Putin, Zelensky. Kadyrov. There's no end to where that could go.
Well, yeah. So if the US and Israel get away with assassinating the Ayatollah Khamenei, then you're right. It does open a very dangerous door where you kind of normalize assassination of leaders, and you might not like the Ayatollah, but I think
then the gloves come off and it becomes very unpredictable.
Those things go both ways.
I'm going to explore that concept, perhaps controversially, and where it might lead. It also comes off the news, apparently, that Ukraine has had opportunities, tangible opportunities, to target Putin, and has been heavily leaned on and persuaded by the US not to go down that route. And yet one can only speculate how many Ukrainian lives would have been saved if that operation had moved forward.
There's a kind of trying to predict the future kind of thing. You could, that could go every which way if that had happened. And you might get a lot of international pushback as well. So a lot of allied nations would be very unhappy about Ukraine assassinating Putin.
They will once it's done. Though, once it's done, it's in the anticipation. I think a lot of that criticism comes once it's done, and events then start to have a momentum of their own. I wonder what the reaction would be. I think that reaction would be very contingent on how it pans out. If Russia moved to relatively seamlessly to a less toxic regime, I think people would move on very quickly and go, you know what, that was a bit of a risk, but hey, it's worked out okay. So it's very contingent on what happens next. But let's tackle some of those things in the next one.
Just the very last super chat, Michael Vuchar. I know he's quite big on China. Michael, you said you wrote a big thing on China, and I didn't know where you wrote it. If you sent it to me on Messenger, I haven't got around to looking at my Messenger messages yet, so I will do that. Why do you two think that Xi Jinping is still in power? The Russians sent bad Uncle Lukashenko to see what was going on. All the info out of China states that he is being removed at the fourth plenum in August. So this is the idea that Xi Jinping might actually have his days numbered there. And thank you very much for the support there, by the way, Michael.
I
don't
know
know
anything about that. No idea at all, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and so yeah, it probably is worth looking into that. But thank you for suggesting that that might be an eventuality. I know you're saying that Michael has said previously that Xi Jinping is actually, there is no power there at the moment. That as you said, the days are numbered. So, however, it's not about the cards you have; it's about the cards the other players think you have, and so it's about the perception of Xi Jinping's power. Even if you think, well, things in China might suggest X, Y, Z, as far as the rest of the world goes, it is about how the US, for example, perceives Xi Jinping and perceives China. So I always think that mantra is a fairly useful one to have. That's why that's how I go through life, just assuming, go through life assuming I've got the best cards, even though my cards are shite. And just as long as as long as you guys think I've got the best cards, then that's fine.
I mean, your cards aren't that bad. You have cards, Jonathan. You have cards.
I'm not Zelensky. I have cards. Well, Zelensky's got cards. Yeah. Well, look, mate. What are your final words? Your thoughts about Iran and US going forward?
I think it's going to be interesting. The next couple of days, I don't expect Israel to let up. I don't know what the US will do. I imagine the decision's on a knife edge. They will be looking at social media. They will be looking at reactions to MAGA and even people within the administration. So I think what Tulsi Gabbard has come out with is probably quite important, actually. And I don't think they will ignore these signals. Trump has thrown a lot of strong words around, but he's well known for retracting and tacoing. So I think it's all up in the air at the moment. But no, Israel is like a dog with a bone. It smells defeat of the Iranian regime, and I think for them, they consider it existential, and they're going to carry on hammering Iran to the point where potentially the regime becomes extremely brittle.
I'm just seeing there's reference to toe rag, as I often use the term toe rag in the thread there. And just to let people know what a tow rag is, it's tow, TWO, because you towed the rag off the back of a naval ship in times of old, and you would use that rag to wipe your ass, and then when you go for a number two, and then you put it back in the water and it'd be towed along and get cleaned, and someone else can use that same thing to wipe their backside, and it is a tow rag. So calling someone a tow rag is a polite way of calling them a big piece of toilet material.
You learn something every day. I didn't know that one. I like that though.
I'm going to leave you with the typical situation here. Politically, Zelensky's left G7 early without meeting Trump, which we knew, as Canada drops the Ukraine statement amid US pushback. The US can't do, the Trump administration just can't do anything for Ukraine. It is physically impossible. It is mentally impossible for the Trump administration to do anything positive for Ukraine. So Canada dropped plans for the Group of Seven to issue a joint statement on the war in Ukraine after the United States pushed to weaken the language, according to the Canadian official speaking on the sidelines of the summit. So typical, bloody typical.
It's and what was that statement going to say? Do we know what the contents?
I presume it would have been just a pretty generic thing, like something along the lines of, we deplore what the aggressor nation Russia is doing in invading, blah blah blah. And as we know previously, the US is just dead against any kind of language that shows moral culpability for the Russians.
So more just disgraceful nonsense, really. And statements are all very well, but it's not statements that Ukraine needs. It's weapons and the will to win. So maybe statements are neither here nor there at this point.
Yeah, I'm just sorry. I've just got sidetracked with looking into tow rags and whether what is the etymology and whether that is the correct etymology of tow rag. And it does seem that it can actually be spelled TOE as well, and that then gives a different theory as to what the etymology of toe rag is. Therefore, referring to the rags of the poor people, convicts or tramps, would wrap around their feet as a makeshift form of footwear. Some sources also connected to rags tied to toe lines, dirty rags. So that's the naval one that I was talking about. So toe rags, or how sailors clean their bums. So yeah, it looks like there are competing theories there. I much prefer the old naval one myself. Sounds much more exciting. Okay.
I mean, it's scatological, so of course you're gonna go for it.
Yeah, everyone loves talking about buns, right? Of course, because we're all like 8 years old. Toe rags, or how sailors clean their bums. So there you go. That's what I'm sticking with. So on that very savoury note, thank you very much, Mr. Fink. I really appreciate the time we have spent together, and I'm going to slowly sup the rest of my white port, courtesy of the great shop, the Little Whiskey Shop in Stockbridge, and think fondly about more peaceful times. Only a mere 4 years ago.
Only 4 years ago, when we weren't doing this thing. I mean, let's face it, peaceful times don't give us an awful lot to talk about. So
I don't know.
I reckon
I can talk about bloody anything, mate. So
we'll go back on to theistic topics. Yeah, there'll be plenty to chew the fat of it.
Absolutely. Well, look, you take care, my good man, and thank you very much to the live stream. Thank you to the mods. I really appreciate all of you. Slava Ukraini, my good man.
Haram slava, smert varagam.
Excellent. Take care, y'all.